I have experienced being truly and completely lost only once in my life. I was on a solo retreat at a retreat center in Minnesota. The center was the only glimpse of civilization in the midst of a very large woods. So one afternoon, I decided to take a walk in that woods. And I headed out in what I thought was a straight line away from the center, and I walked about a half hour or so. Then I decided it was going to start getting dark long before I wanted it to. That's not me, by the way. Then I turned around to head back to the center in what I thought was a straight line. I walked about a half an hour and did not see one thing that I recognized, much less a glimpse of the center. Figuring out I'd gotten turned around, I started walking in a different direction, and then a different direction, and then a different direction, and then a different direction, until I finally realized I was completely and totally lost in that woods. It was in that moment that I wondered why I had left home in the first place. I was hoping the retreat center would help me grow closer to God, but I was lost and not really close to much of anything. Now, the Hebrew people were lost in the wilderness. They'd left their homes in Egypt to reach the land that Moses and God had promised to them. They had no idea where they were. All they knew was that they were lost. They were thirsty, and they were wondering why they had ever left Egypt in the first place. The wilderness did not bring out the best in the Hebrew people. In fact, they were a pretty unpleasant group to travel with. Every time they encountered a problem, the people went to Moses and just whined. Why did you bring us out of the wilderness? First, you tried to starve us to death. Now we're going to die of thirst. We should have stayed in Egypt, where we had plenty of food to eat and plenty of water to drink. Well, just 2 chapters later, in the book of Exodus, while Moses was up on Mount Sinai, the people not only gave up on Moses, but they gave up on God. And they decided to build themselves a golden calf. And they worshiped that. The wilderness did not bring out their best. In fact, the wilderness brought out the worst in this group of people, because being lost between the now idealized past and the promised land, which seemed so far away, really made them afraid. And their fear made them resentful. And their resentment made them rebellious. And their rebellion led to a really bad outcome. We're walking through a wilderness right now, I think. We're lost in the wilderness between the life we knew before COVID and the promise of life once a vaccine is available. We are lost in the wilderness between the primary elections and the November election results. We're lost in the wilderness between the end of the Civil War and the fulfillment of the promise of freedom for all people. We're lost between going back to school the way we used to and the promise of going back to school like we used to. We're lost between the death of Justice Ginsburg and the approval of a new justice. We are lost between having completed this beautiful new space in our church building and the promise of one day being actually able to use this beautiful new space in our church building. We are walking through the wilderness, and some days we're afraid. Some days we whine and complain. Some days we blame anyone and everyone for our problems. And some days, like the Hebrew people, we even wonder if God is among us or not. We witness the effects of being lost in the wilderness. We're afraid. We don't know what to do. We truly do not know how to get out of this wilderness. And we realize that in so many ways, we are absolutely powerless to find our way out of the wilderness. So rather than admit we do not have the power to get ourselves out of the wilderness, rather than admit we're afraid, we become angry. We whine. We rebel. We blame others for getting us lost in the first place. Now, the first thing I did when I was lost in that woods surrounding the retreat center was panic. I was afraid. I was angry with myself for getting so completely turned around. I blamed the retreat center for not having marked trails for walking in the woods. I realized I was absolutely ill-equipped for this particular moment. I'd come to the retreat center in hopes of growing closer to God, but in that moment, I wanted to run home, wrap up in a blanket, and eat ice cream. Getting closer to God was less important to me in that moment than knowing where I was and how to get out of there as fast as possible. We are lost in the wilderness of 2020 right now. It's been a year that has left some of us afraid, some of us angry, some of us whining, and most of us looking for someone else to blame. And we're seeing signs of rebellion taking shape in different ways for different people. We can't imagine what the future will look like, or even when it will come, so we would really just as soon go back to the past. At least it was home. It wasn't necessarily ideal, but we knew it. When the people complained, Moses took their complaints to God. And at this point, I wonder if Moses and God weren't just getting tired of the Hebrew people and their continual complaints. And God may very well have been tired of the complaining, but even so, God graciously offered water to the Hebrew people. In fact, God responded graciously to every complaint the Hebrew people had. That was until they rebelled against God and began worshiping the golden calf. God did not take that at all well. We're in the midst of the wilderness. We know there's a future for us, but we don't know how far away it is or what it's going to look like. Some people say there's going to be a vaccine coming out before the end of the year. Other people say maybe 18 months. That's a little bit frustrating. It's a whole lot frightening. And it would be nice to have somebody to blame. My guess is we are complaining and pondering in our hearts about rebelling. We may even blame ourselves for being afraid and then get angry because we're afraid. We may even begin to wonder if God is aware of our wilderness. And we may wonder if God even cares. We wonder if God has a plan for how to get us out of this wilderness. Well, in the midst of the wilderness, God has given us many blessings. And perhaps the biggest blessing God has given us in the wilderness is free will, meaning we have the freedom to choose how we're going to respond to the wilderness. God has given us the freedom to choose whether we're going to wear a mask or not. God has given us the freedom to choose whether we will practice social distancing or cluster close together with whoever we choose. God has given us the freedom to choose which leader, which doctor, or which elected official that we're going to give our trust. God has given us the freedom to long for the past or look forward to the future. God has given us the freedom to turn to God for help or trust our own abilities. God has given us the freedom to choose to trust God or rebel against God by turning to idols of our own making. The freedom to make choices is one of the greatest gifts that God has given to us. When I was lost in that woods in Minnesota, after trying a variety of ways to get out of that wilderness, I finally stopped floundering around long enough to take a few deep breaths. And only then did I remember that I was not hopelessly lost. God knew exactly where I was. So I stood still and listened. Listened, hoping God would give me some sort of sign as to how to get out of there. Not the exact language I used, but it was close. I stood and listened, and I heard in the distance the sound of a car going down a road. So I turned and started walking toward that sound, and when I came to the roadway, I finally knew where I was. We have the choice to listen to God in the midst of the wilderness, because God knows exactly where we are, and God knows exactly how we will get out of this wilderness. God will lead us to the place that comes next for us. It may not be the promised land, but it will be the place we need to be next. Rather than listen to God, the Hebrew people rebelled against God, and many died as a result. And that journey out of the wilderness that should have taken just a few months ended up taking 40 years. 2 generations of people traveling with Moses had to die off before God trusted the new folks to head toward the promised land. I really hope our wilderness doesn't take that long. And I don't think it will if we just all stop for a moment, take a few deep breaths, and calm down long enough to listen for God. Or as Ciara suggested, ask for help. Because God knows where we are, and God will help get us out of the wilderness. Trusting God is a choice that we have been given. Getting angry, afraid, or rebellious, rebelling against God are choices also. I pray you listen for God.